Hello, neighbors. Before we get into the episode, just a couple quick things I'd like to mention. If you go to the podcast website, neighborontheLeft.com, there's a whole bunch of things for you to check out there, including the contacts page, where you can see all of the social media links. And these days, I do post a lot of stuff just about daily on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. A lot of interesting stuff there. If you stop by, please like, share, and follow if you would. Also on the website, there is the episodes section where you can download or stream any episode of the podcast going all the way back to the beginning. And of course, the blog section. I make a post for every episode of the podcast, and it includes all of the sources that I use. All right, let's start the episode. America has turned away from God. That's the diagnosis. You hear it from Republican politicians, conservative commentators, politically active pastors, Christian nationalist organizations, and a whole cottage industry of people who seem to believe the country began collapsing the moment somebody stopped saying Merry Christmas loudly enough. We abandoned traditional values. We removed prayer from schools. We stopped respecting the family. We embraced secularism. We traded biblical truth for moral confusion. And according to the story, the right has been telling us for decades, nearly every social problem we face can be traced back to that one great departure. Crime, poverty, broken families, addiction, teen pregnancy, failing schools, loneliness, disorder. The diagnosis is spiritual decline, and the prescription is always more of the same. More Christianity in public life, more prayer in schools, more 10 Commandments on classroom walls, more politicians invoking God, more laws rooted in traditional morality, more insistence that America is not merely a country where Christianity is protected, but a Christian nation whose government should reflect Christian values. Fine. Let's take that claim seriously, because that is not merely an expression of personal faith. That is a political promise. The promise is that stronger public Christianity produces stronger families, safer communities, healthier people, better schools, greater prosperity, more stable marriages, more responsible citizens, overall a better society. All right, then we should be able to see it. Where in America has conservative Christianity maintained its greatest cultural influence? Where is church attendance high? Where do evangelical Christians make up a large share of the population? Where have Republican politicians governed for years while campaigning on faith and family law and order, personal responsibility and traditional values? The Bible Belt. And if the theory is correct, the Bible Belt should be the showcase. It should be the place Republicans point to and say, there, that is our philosophy. That's what it produces. That is the evidence. So in this episode, I want to take a look, not at the slogans, not at the campaign speeches, not at the politician holding the Bible as though it came without instructions, but at the results. Because if you have spent decades promising that your moral vision produces a better society, eventually, someone has the right to ask, where are the results? Show me the evidence. Hello, neighbors. You are listening to a Friday edition of Back Porch Files from your neighbor on the left, the podcast about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, your opinionated host. And today we're going to do something that politics usually works very hard to avoid. We're going to test the sales pitch. I am definitely not here to mock anyone's faith or sneer at believers. I'm not going to pretend that religion has no value. I don't believe any of that. We're going to take a political claim, treat it seriously, and ask whether the evidence supports it. Because there is a difference between saying, my faith gives my life meaning, and saying my faith should shape public policy because it produces better societies. The first claim is personal. The second claim is measurable. Republicans and the broader conservative movement have spent decades telling us that America's problems come from abandoning Christianity and traditional values. That the family is collapsing because the culture became too secular. That schools are failing because prayer disappeared. That crime and poverty and addiction and social disorder are symptoms of a moral decline. And that the cure is to put Christianity back at the center of American life. Well, that is a promise. And promises come with receipts. So today what I want to do is I want to compare the rhetoric with the outcomes. We're going to look at the places where conservative Christianity has held some of its greatest cultural and political influence. We're going to ask what those communities look like in measures that actually affect people's lives. Health, education, poverty, family stability, public safety. And we're also going to ask whether the politicians preaching this morality live according to the standards they impose on everyone else. Now, I want to say this clearly. This episode is not about the church volunteer stocking the food pantry. It's not about the grandmother who prays for her family every day. It's not about millions of religious people trying to live decent, generous lives. This is about political leaders who turn religion into a campaign brand, then demand power on the promise that their moral vision will create a better country. That is the claim. And today I want to test it. So let's begin with the promise itself. Before we can decide whether the promise holds up, we have to be clear about what the promise actually is. Because I don't want to argue against a straw man. I want to argue against what Republican politicians and conservative leaders have actually been saying. And to be fair, they don't all say it exactly the same way. Some frame it as a matter of personal faith. Others frame it as a cultural renewal. Others wrap it up in patriotism. Some go much farther and argue that America was explicitly founded as a Christian nation that must once again be governed according to biblical principles. Different messages, different messengers, I guess I should say, same underlying story. America's problems are not primarily economic, they're moral. The diagnosis always comes back to the same place. We've drifted away from God. Former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee once said, "The solution to every problem in America is very simple. It's one nation under God, and if we ever become one nation without God, then we will be a nation gone under." Former House Speaker Newt Gingrich argued that America faces, quote, "a crisis of secularism," end quote, and that the country can't survive if it abandons its religious foundations. More recently, House Speaker Mike Johnson has repeatedly said that the nation's problems stem from abandoning biblical principles, famously telling audiences that if they want to understand his politics, they should simply pick up a Bible. And we have to throw in Donald Trump here as well. He has declared, to have a great nation, you have to have religion. Now, notice what's happening here. Those aren't merely statements about personal belief. They are claims about cause and effect. They are saying religion doesn't just improve individual lives, it improves societies. And that is a very different argument. And if that's true, then there should be evidence. Republicans have spent decades weaving this idea into nearly every major cultural debate. Prayer in schools, 10 Commandments in classrooms, restrictions on abortion, opposition to same-sex marriage, resistance to comprehensive sex education, book bans, restrictions on discussions of gender identity, campaigns against what they call woke ideology. All of these are presented as pieces of a larger effort to restore America's moral foundation. Because according to the argument, morality produces order. Order produces strong families produce healthy communities produce prosperity. It's almost presented like a mathematical equation. Christian values equals a strong America. Now, pause for a second. There's nothing unreasonable about believing that faith can positively influence individual behavior. Of course it can. For millions of people, faith is a cornerstone. It provides purpose, community, hope, discipline, forgiveness, a moral framework. There is plenty of evidence that religious participation can benefit individuals in various ways depending on the person and the community that you're talking about. That isn't what we're testing. We're testing something much bigger. We're testing whether building public policy around conservative Christianity consistently produces better outcomes for entire states and communities. Because Republicans haven't simply said, my faith helps me. They've said, this is the blueprint America needs. And those are very different claims. And here's where I think conservatives often receive a free pass that no one else gets. Imagine if progressives spent 50 years saying universal health care would dramatically improve the nation's health. And after 50 years, the states most committed to that policy consistently had worse health outcomes. Would Republicans let that slide? Not a chance. They would demand answers. They would ask for evidence. They would say the theory is flawed or failed. Fair enough. That's exactly what I want to do here. Not because we're applying a different standard, but because we're applying the same standard. If you promise results, show the results. If you promise stronger families, show the families. If you promise safer communities, show the communities. If you promise healthier children, show the children. Politics is full of slogans, family values, law and order, traditional morality. They all sound great. They all sound reassuring, but slogans are not evidence. Campaign speeches are not evidence. Holding up a Bible, maybe upside down, during a photo opportunity is definitely not evidence. At some point, every governing philosophy has to leave the campaign stage and enter the real world. It has to answer a simple question. Did people's lives actually get better? Because that's the whole point of governing. Not winning the argument, not owning the libs, not putting on a better 4th of July rally. It's making people's lives better. And if conservative Christianity truly is the secret ingredient Republicans have been selling for decades, then reality should look a certain way. So let's go find out what reality actually looks like. So where do we test this promise? We start in the Bible Belt. Now, the Bible Belt is not an official jurisdiction. There is no Department of Biblical Geography. No federal agency stamps states as extra Christian. And its borders are not perfectly defined. But culturally, the term generally refers to the South and portions of surrounding states where evangelical Protestant Christianity has traditionally exercised strong influence over community life and social expectations and politics. Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Tennessee, Louisiana, South Carolina, Oklahoma, large parts of Texas and Georgia, Kentucky, North Carolina, West Virginia. The precise borders on this map vary. The broader pattern doesn't. The South remains the center of evangelical Christianity in the United States. Pew Research Center's latest religious landscape study found that evangelical Protestants make up about 23% of American adults nationally, but more than half of all American evangelicals live in the South. The region is also home to 42% of all American Christians, even though it contains considerably less than half the country's population. And religion here is not merely a private affiliation. It's woven into public life. Candidates campaign from church pulpits. Governors issue prayer proclamations. Legislators invoke scripture while debating public policy. School boards fight over Bible instruction, prayer, evolution, sex education, LGBTQ students, and which books children should be allowed to read. Republican officials describe political contests as spiritual battles. Christian nationalist organizations argue that America isn't simply a nation where Christians enjoy religious freedom, but a Christian nation whose laws should reflect a particular understanding of Christianity. Now, an important distinction: the Bible Belt is not politically or religiously uniform. It contains progressive Christians, black churches with deep roots in the civil rights movement, Catholics, mainline Protestants, Jewish communities, Muslim communities, people of other faiths, and millions of people with no religious affiliation at all. Not every Southern Christian votes Republican. Not every evangelical supports Christian nationalism. And the black church tradition cannot honestly be folded into the same political category as white evangelical conservatism just because both contain the word Christian. We are not examining everyone who lives in the South. We are examining the political philosophy that has held enormous influence there. And that influence has not lacked an opportunity to govern. As of May of this year, Republicans controlled more state legislative chambers nationally than Democrats, with much of that power concentrated across the South and other heavily conservative regions. In many Bible Belt states, Republicans control both legislative chambers and the governor's office. They write the budgets, they set education policy, they decide whether to expand Medicaid, they determine eligibility for food assistance, they write criminal laws, they regulate abortion, they establish labor policy, they decide what public schools teach and what private libraries may carry. In other words, this is not an ideology waiting patiently for its chance. It has had the chance. It has governed. And that makes the Bible Belt relevant to the question we're talking about today. If conservative Christian politics creates stronger families, the evidence should appear here. If traditional morality reduces things like teen pregnancy and divorce and other maladies, the pattern should appear here. If law and order government creates safety, the result should appear here. If low taxes, limited public assistance, and personal responsibility create prosperity, we should find the economic outcomes here. If restricting abortion protects mothers and children, maternal and infant health and should be especially strong here. And if placing Christianity closer to the center of public life improves society, this region should be the success story. And again, we're not pretending religion is the only variable. These states have different histories, economies, racial demographics, levels of urbanization, healthcare systems, educational challenges. We're not going to find a bad statistic, point at the nearest church and yell, "Aha!" That would be ridiculous. And I try not to be ridiculous. But Republicans made the promise. They said this worldview produces better communities, and the places where that worldview has had the greatest influence gives us somewhere to look for the evidence. So let's look. If conservative Christianity produces stronger communities, the Bible Belt should be America's showcase. So here's the report card. All right, now comes the part where we stop arguing philosophy and we start looking at outcomes. This is where I want to slow down for a second because I don't want to overstate the case. If Alabama has a higher poverty rate than Minnesota, that does not prove that Christianity caused it. If Mississippi struggles with healthcare access, that does not mean church attendance is somehow harmful. That would be as intellectually lazy as claiming that removing prayer from schools caused crime. Correlation is not causation. You've heard me say that many times before, and you'll probably hear me say it many times again, but here's what correlation does tell us. It tells us whether a theory deserves confidence. If someone tells you a particular fertilizer grows the healthiest tomatoes, and every garden using that fertilizer consistently produces weak plants, you probably aren't going to declare the fertilizer the cause. But you also aren't rushing out to buy a bag of it. The evidence isn't supporting the sales pitch in that case. That's where we are today. We're testing the sales pitch. So let's talk about economic well-being. Let's start with the most basic measure imaginable. Can people make a decent living? Because for all of the speeches about morality, family values become much less easier to practice when the rent is paid. The latest Census Bureau data shows that several Bible Belt states continue to rank among the poorest. Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, West Virginia, Alabama. These states have consistently recorded poverty rates above the national average. Child poverty follows much the same pattern. Now that's worth pausing on. Children don't choose the circumstances they're born into. They don't vote. They don't write budgets. They don't decide whether Medicaid expands or whether schools receive additional funding. Yet, some of the states that speak most passionately about protecting children also have some of the highest rates of children growing up in poverty. Now, Republicans often respond by pointing to history, and they are right to do so. The South has endured generations of structural poverty. Its economy developed differently. Many communities are rural, manufacturing declined, agriculture changed. Those realities matter. But remember what we're evaluating. We're evaluating a promise that has been made repeatedly for decades. That conservative governance rooted in Christian values and personal responsibility produces stronger communities. If that's true, why hasn't decades of Republican leadership dramatically changed those outcomes? Show me the evidence. Because slogans don't reduce poverty. Policy does that. Let's move to health. This one surprised me when I first started digging into the data. If I had asked people to name the states with some of the greatest health challenges in America, I suspect many people would have guessed correctly because the pattern has been remarkably consistent. Across much of the Bible Belt, people are more likely to struggle with obesity. They're more likely to have diabetes. They're more likely to lack health insurance, more likely to live in counties where hospitals have closed, and on average, life expectancy is lower than in many parts of the Northeast and West. Think about that for a second. If a political philosophy claims to produce healthier communities, health ought to be one of the strongest report cards. Instead, it often becomes one of the weakest. And nowhere is that contradiction more striking than in healthcare itself. Many Republican-controlled states spent years refusing to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. Not because they couldn't, because they chose not to. Reasonable people can debate the proper size of government. They can debate taxes, they can debate healthcare systems, but they cannot honestly claim that refusing to insure more low-income residents somehow demonstrates a greater commitment to protecting life. Because life doesn't end in the delivery room. It continues in pediatric clinics and cancer centers and mental health facilities and emergency rooms and rural hospitals. If protecting life is truly the moral priority, those places matter too. Now, let's talk about education and opportunity. Education tells a similar story. Conservatives often argue that schools have declined because they became too secular, too permissive, too progressive, too focused on diversity instead of discipline. Maybe. But here's what schools also need: qualified teachers, modern textbooks, safe buildings, reliable transportation, school counselors, special education services, libraries, science labs, enough funding to keep talented teachers from leaving the profession altogether. Prayer cannot substitute for any of those things. Neither can a Ten Commandments poster, for that matter. And this is not an argument against the Ten Commandments. It's simply recognizing that a classroom wall has never taught algebra. Teachers do that. Resources do that. Investment does that. The irony is difficult to ignore. Some of the same legislatures spending enormous political energy debating what teachers may say often spend far less energy making sure teachers have what they need to succeed. The culture war becomes the curriculum. Meanwhile, the reading scores remain stubbornly unimpressed. How about family stability? This is where the Republican argument should be the strongest. After all, family values has been one of the party's defining brands for generations. So what does the evidence show? Teen birth rates have fallen dramatically nationwide. And that is excellent news. But historically, many Bible Belt states have continued to rank among those with the highest teen birth rates. Researchers generally credit that national decline to things like better contraception, improved education, and changing behavior. Not simply more moral messaging. Likewise, divorce rates are more complicated than internet memes might suggest. The relationship between religiosity and divorce is not nearly as simple as either side sometimes claims. And that's important to acknowledge, but it's also kind of the point. The evidence is mixed, which means the sweeping claim that greater public religiosity naturally creates dramatically stronger families simply is not supported by the data. Reality is more complicated than the slogan. And then there's public safety, crime. Republicans have long campaigned as the party of law and order, and yet several Bible Belt states have historically combined high incarceration rates with persistently high rates of violent crime. Now, that of course does not mean that incarceration never works. It does mean incarceration isn't enough by itself. You can build prisons and you can lengthen sentences and you can campaign on being tough, but if poverty, untreated addiction, inadequate education, unstable housing, and poor economic opportunity don't get any attention, crime has a frustrating habit of returning anyway. Which brings us back to the larger point. The report card doesn't prove that Christianity failed. That's not it at all. It doesn't prove religious people failed. It doesn't prove church is bad. It proves something much narrower. The evidence does not support the political claim that making society more publicly Christian reliably produces healthier, safer, more prosperous communities. If anything, the evidence tells us something much less satisfying. Communities succeed or struggle for very complicated reasons: economics, education, healthcare, their history, opportunity, policy. All of those things matter, and they matter a lot. Which raises an obvious question. If religion isn't the variable doing most of the work, what is? The honest answer to that question is complicated, which means it is already at a disadvantage in American politics. Complicated answers do not fit comfortably on bumper stickers. You can't chant intergenerational poverty, healthcare infrastructure, and regional economic decline at a campaign rally without losing the crowd. But those things matter. History matters. Geography matters. Race, education, employment, healthcare, public investment, all matter. Policy matters a lot. Take rural poverty. Many Bible Belt communities were built around industries that have disappeared, shrunk, or become more automated. Coal, textiles, manufacturing, small family farms. When those jobs vanish, communities don't instantly reinvent themselves as biotechnology hubs. Young people leave. The tax base shrinks. Schools struggle. Housing deteriorates. Doctors become harder to recruit. Businesses see fewer customers and less reason to invest. One problem begins feeding the next. That is not a failure of faith. That is an economic cycle. And breaking that cycle requires more than telling people to work harder. It requires jobs that exist, wages that people can live on, education connected to real opportunities, broadband, roads, healthcare, childcare, housing, the basic machinery that allows community to function. The same is true of health. More than 100 rural hospitals closed between 2013 and 2020. The Government Accountability Office found that residents affected by closures had to travel about 20 miles on average farther for common hospital services and roughly 40 miles farther for less common care, including some addiction treatment services, things like that. GAO also found that rural hospitals in states that expanded Medicaid experienced fewer closures. That's not an abstract policy dispute. That is another 20 miles when you're having a heart attack. Another 40 miles when somebody finally asks for help with addiction. Another county between a pregnant woman and a delivery room. And whether low-income residents have insurance is not determined by the number of churches in the county. It is determined in part by decisions made in the state capital. States that fully implemented the Affordable Care Act, including Medicaid expansion, generally achieved lower uninsured rates and greater improvements in access to care. The Commonwealth Fund's 2025 state scorecard found that policy choices were a major reason health coverage differed so dramatically among states. That is where the Republican explanation begins to unravel. Because Republicans often describe social problems as the consequence of individual moral failure. People are poor because they made bad choices. They are unhealthy because they lack discipline. They need assistance because they failed to take responsibility. Sometimes individual choices do matter, of course they do. But personal responsibility cannot keep open a hospital that has closed. It cannot create a job that left town 15 years ago. It can't repair a contaminated water system. It can't make rent affordable when wages remain low and housing is scarce. And it cannot overcome a school system that has been underfunded for generations. The language of personal responsibility becomes politically useful because it transfers responsibility away from the government. If every struggle is evidence of defective character, then policymakers never have to answer for defective policies. Poverty becomes a sin. Illness is a lifestyle choice. Hunger is dependency. Underfunding becomes fiscal discipline. It's all very convenient, just not very convincing. There is also some history that the traditional value story tends to sort of glide past. Many Southern communities are still living with the economic and social effects of slavery and segregation, discriminatory housing policy, unequal schools, exclusion from wealth-building opportunities, and deliberate racial voter suppression. Those systems didn't just disappear without leaving fingerprints. They shaped where people live, what property they inherited, what schools received resources, where hospitals were actually built, who accumulated wealth, who did not. You can't explain today's outcomes honestly while treating history as an optional prequel. And this brings us to the real political contradiction. Churches throughout the Bible Belt often perform extraordinary work. They operate food banks and shelters and addiction programs and disaster relief and clothing drives. They help people with rent and utilities. In many communities, they are holding together the social fabric with volunteers and donated canned goods and sheer determination. But their generosity also reveals the scale of the need. A food pantry is evidence of compassion. It's also evidence that people are hungry. Charity can help a family through a crisis. It can't replace a functioning healthcare system, an adequate wage, affordable housing, or a properly funded school. Faith can inspire people to serve. Government determines whether that service is supported by effective policy or forced to compensate for its absence. So the question is no longer whether Christianity caused the Bible Belt's struggles. It did not. Of course it didn't. The more revealing question is this: when Republican leaders confronted the real causes, poverty, inequality, weak infrastructure, limited health care, underinvestment, what did they choose to do? Because many of these problems are not simply cultural conditions. They are most definitely policy outcomes. And the same movement that promises moral renewal has spent decades writing those policies, which means it's time to move away from what they promise to whether they practice what they preach. So far, we've examined the first part of the Republican promise, the promise that conservative Christianity produces better outcomes. Now let's look at the second part of the equation, because even if the data had come back mixed, there would still be another question that I think is worth asking. Do people making these moral arguments actually live by them? Or are these standards reserved for everyone else? So let's start with the phrase that we've all heard for decades: family values. Republicans didn't invent the family, but they absolutely branded themselves as its exclusive guardians. They told us they were the party of faithful marriages and strong fathers and personal morality and sexual restraint, traditional families. If Democrats were supposedly the party of moral decline, Republicans wanted to be seen as the party of moral leadership. And then the reality kept interrupting the marketing campaign. Donald Trump has been married 3 times. He was found liable in civil court for sexually abusing and defaming E. Jean Carroll. He was convicted of 34 felony counts involving the falsification of business records connected to hush money payments made during the 2016 campaign. None of those facts automatically make him incapable of governing, but they certainly complicate the idea that he became the unquestioned champion of family values. Well, and also calls into question the assertion that he was sent by God, but that's another episode. Then there's Newt Gingrich. I mentioned him earlier, one of the architects of the Republican Party's moral crusade in the 1990s. He criticized President Bill Clinton's personal conduct while carrying on an extramarital affair of his own. The irony is almost too efficient. It's difficult to lecture the country about marital fidelity while simultaneously treating your own marriage like a temporary committee assignment. And then there's Ken Paxton. Oh, Ken Paxton. The Texas Attorney General spent years lauding family values while publicly battling allegations of an extramarital affair that became part of testimony during his impeachment proceedings. And again, this isn't about claiming Republicans are uniquely imperfect. Every political party, it has its share of hypocrites. Although, Ken Paxton is now the Trump chosen nominee for the Senate in Texas. But yes, every political party contains hypocrites. Every ideology contains people who fail to meet its ideals. That is human. The question is different. Why does the movement that most loudly markets itself as morally superior so often ask voters to ignore behavior it would strenuously condemn if the letter after the politician's name was a D and not an R? Show me the evidence. Show me that character matters consistently, not selectively, because moral standards that only apply to political opponents aren't standards, they're weapons. Then there's one of conservatism's favorite phrases: personal responsibility. Now, before anyone starts typing me an angry email, personal responsibility matters. Of course it matters. People make choices, and choices have consequences. No progressive should have any trouble acknowledging that, and if they do, they don't have my vote. However, here is what puzzles me. The same politicians who tell struggling Americans to take responsibility often oppose policies that make responsibility far easier to practice. Affordable health care, paid family leave, universal school meals, expanded child care, the child tax credit, Medicaid expansion, SNAP benefits, housing assistance. Think about that. A parent working 2 jobs who can't afford insulin isn't demonstrating a lack of responsibility. They're demonstrating a lack of money. A child arriving at school hungry didn't make irresponsible choices. They're just hungry. And if your answer to that child is a lecture about self-reliance, you're not teaching responsibility. You're avoiding responsibility. Because there's something Republicans rarely acknowledge. Responsibility isn't just an individual virtue. It's also a governmental one. A responsible government invests in things that help people succeed. Healthy children and good schools and safe roads, reliable infrastructure, accessible healthcare. Those are not handouts. They are foundations. Now let's talk about law and order. Republicans have campaigned on that phrase certainly my entire lifetime. Respect the police, respect the courts, respect the rule of law, unless the law becomes inconvenient. January 6th should have permanently complicated the Republican Party's claim to exclusive ownership of law and order. A mob assaulted police officers, smashed windows, forced its way into the United States Capitol, temporarily halted the peaceful transfer of presidential power. More than 140 officers were injured. Hundreds of participants were convicted in federal court, and yet instead of treating that attack as an assault on law itself, many Republicans minimized it. Some called the participants political prisoners. Some described them as patriots. Donald Trump pardoned or commuted the sentences of hundreds and hundreds of January 6th defendants as soon as he returned to office. Again, you have to notice the pattern. Law and order until the law reaches our team. Support the police until the police testify against supporters. Respect judges until the judges rule against us. It's not that Republicans don't believe in law and order. It's that too often they appear to believe in conditional law and order. How about fiscal responsibility? Remember when balancing the budget was practically a Republican religious chant? You couldn't propose a new government program without hearing that America was going broke. Debt was immoral. Deficits threatened our grandchildren. Government spending had to be restrained. Then something curious kept happening. Republican presidents routinely left office with substantially larger national debts than when they entered. Sometimes because of recession, sometimes because of wars, sometimes because of tax cuts that were never paired with corresponding spending reductions. Deficits were terrifying, right up until they became politically useful. Apparently, fiscal responsibility has developed a flexible work schedule. Oh, and then there's states' rights. I've mentioned this one a lot recently. If you've listened to conservative politics for any length of time, you're familiar with this one. Washington shouldn't tell states how to run their schools, or their elections, or their healthcare systems, or their criminal laws. Local control, federalism, 10th Amendment, until a state does something Republicans don't like. Until a state protects abortion rights, adopts stricter gun regulations, expands protections for LGBTQ residents, creates sanctuary policies. Then, suddenly, federal intervention starts sounding a lot more attractive. Apparently, states' rights sometimes expire at the state line of a blue state. And finally, free speech. Republicans rightly criticize attempts to silence unpopular opinions. Good for them, so do I. The First Amendment matters. But free speech becomes a much harder principle to recognize when books start disappearing from libraries. Teachers are warned about discussing certain historical topics. Universities become targets for political retaliation, or corporations are punished for expressing viewpoints that politicians don't like. Free speech isn't tested when people say things you already agree with. It's tested when they say things that make you grind your teeth. That applies to everyone, liberals included. Take the super popular example of Charlie Kirk. We can argue all day long about Charlie Kirk, but the one thing I won't argue about is that he had an absolute right to say the things he was saying. I found some of them disgusting. I found some of them outright BS, but I would never say that he should be silenced. Free speech is supposed to apply to everyone, especially when they're saying something that you don't like. Here's the pattern that emerges from all this. The movement that most often describes itself as America's moral compass repeatedly asks voters to overlook conduct that conflicts with its own message. Now, it's not every Republican, it's not every conservative, it's certainly not every Christian, but enough prominent leaders that it stops looking like coincidence. It starts looking like branding. And branding, like character, can survive almost anything, as long as nobody asks to see the receipts. So why does this message keep working? Why does the right keep returning to the same story even when the evidence refuses to cooperate? Because moral explanations are emotionally satisfying. They are clean and they are simple and they come with villains. If crime rises because society abandoned God, then you don't have to talk about poverty and untreated addiction and housing instability and underfunded schools or easy access to weapons. You just blame moral decline. If families are struggling because feminism ruined marriage, then you don't have to discuss childcare costs and stagnant wages and medical debt and the fact that many families are one emergency away from financial collapse. You just blame feminism. If young people are anxious, lonely, angry because secular culture corrupted them, then you don't have to ask whether they can afford a home or find stable work or access mental health care or realistically imagine a future that feels remotely secure. You just blame secular culture. It is politics with all the messy wiring behind the wall where you can't see it. The lights don't work. Well, it must be sin. And there's another reason why it works. Identity. For many people, religion is not simply something they believe. It's family, it's community, it's memory, it's tradition. It's the church where they were married, the funeral where they said goodbye to a parent, the songs their grandmother sang, the meals delivered when someone got sick, the people who showed up when life fell apart. And that bond is real. And political strategists know exactly how to use it. They tell religious voters that criticism of Republican policy is criticism of their faith. That disagreement with a politician is hostility towards Christianity. That changing culture is not merely changing, but targeting them. That immigrants and feminists and teachers and gay people and secular people and universities and cities and liberals are all part of some coordinated effort to erase their way of life. Now, ladies and gentlemen, fear has entered the sanctuary. Once people believe their identity is under siege, evidence is secondary. A politician no longer has to improve the community. He only has to promise protection from the people who are supposedly destroying it. That is how someone can fail every moral test in his own life and still be sold as a defender of morality. The voters are not always choosing a role model. They are choosing a shield. And the shield does not have to be righteous. It just has to be pointed at the right enemies. That is the darker genius of the politics of morality. It transforms public failure into cultural grievance. A hospital closes, but the governor is fighting drag queens. A school cannot hire teachers, but the legislature is banning those books. Families can't afford childcare, but someone made a transgender kid not play volleyball. The real problem remains. The performance continues. And because the performance feels like defense, it can be mistaken for leadership. But governing is not the art of identifying sinners. It's the work of improving conditions. And once we stop asking who's to blame for moral decline, we can finally ask what actually helps communities thrive. All right, so you say to yourself, okay, Don, if the answer isn't more faith and more religion, what is the answer? What actually builds strong communities? And this is where I think the conversation gets more hopeful, because despite what politicians sometimes suggest, we aren't guessing. We've been studying this for decades. We know a remarkable amount about the conditions that help people flourish. Children do better when they have access to quality early education. Families are more financially stable when wages keep pace with the cost of living. Communities are healthier when people can afford preventative health care instead of waiting until a medical problem becomes an emergency. Crime tends to fall apart when young people have opportunities worth protecting. Educational achievement improves when schools have experienced teachers, adequate funding, smaller class sizes, and students who aren't trying to learn on an empty stomach. None of that is especially mysterious. It also isn't especially partisan, or so I would have thought. The disagreement is usually not over whether these things matter, it's over whether government should help provide them. I guess that's a legitimate debate. How much government is too much government? How should programs be funded? Which policies produce the greatest benefit? Those are democratic arguments. But here's the part that bothers me. Too often the political conversation never gets that far. Instead of debating whether Medicaid expansion improves health outcomes, we argue about whether America needs to pray more. Instead of debating teacher pay, we debate classroom posters. Instead of debating affordable housing, we debate whether Starbucks cups say Merry Christmas on them. One conversation deals with measurable outcomes and the other deals with symbolism. Now, symbolism isn't worthless. Symbols matter. Flags matter. Religious expression matters. Traditions matter. People draw strength from them. Communities are built around them. But symbols cannot substitute for solutions. A child cannot eat a campaign slogan. A struggling family cannot pay a mortgage with a culture war. A rural hospital cannot stay open because the governor declared a day of prayer. Eventually, governing has to move beyond performance. It has to improve people's lives. And that's where I think progressives often approach this differently. I don't particularly care whether my governor quotes scripture in every speech. I care whether people can afford insulin. I don't care whether a senator can recite Bible verses from memory. I care whether veterans receive health care. I don't care how many times a politician says the phrase family values. I care whether families have paid leave and affordable childcare and decent schools and safe neighborhoods and wages that allow parents to spend their time with their kids. Because that's what strong communities actually look like. Not perfect people, not perfect churches, not perfect governments. People who have a fair opportunity to build decent lives. Communities where illness doesn't automatically equal bankruptcy. Where education opens doors instead of closing them. Where children have plenty to eat. Where older Americans can retire with dignity. Where work pays enough to live on. Where opportunity isn't reserved for the zip codes that already have everything. Those aren't liberal values, those are human values. And if a public policy helps produce those outcomes, I don't particularly care whether the person proposing it quotes Jefferson, Jesus, or Jimmy Buffett. Because results matter more than branding, outcome matters more than slogans. Compassion is measured by what happens after they're done giving the speech. That, to me, is what a moral society actually looks like. So, where does that leave us? Not where some people are probably expecting, because this episode was never about proving that religion is bad. I swear it wasn't. Some of the finest people you ever meet are religious. Some of the most generous people in this country are quietly doing extraordinary work through churches every single day. They're running food pantries and building homes and mentoring kids and comforting grieving families, helping people recover from addiction, showing up after disasters. America is better because those people exist, and this episode was not about them. It was about a political promise, a promise that has been repeated for decades, that if America simply became more publicly Christian, more traditionally moral, more like the Bible Belt, our problems would magically resolve themselves. And I think today I answered a simple question. Show me the evidence, and the evidence tells a very different story. Not because religion caused poverty, not because Christianity creates crime, not because faith makes communities weaker. None of those things are true. The evidence tells us something both smaller and I think more important. It tells us that public religiosity is not a substitute for good public policy. You cannot legislate your way to healthier communities with Bible verses alone. You cannot pray away inadequate health care. You cannot sermon your way out of child poverty. No amount of commandment posters are going to get you a better school. And you can't build stronger families while ignoring the economic conditions families actually live in. That is the lesson. The Republican Party has every right to argue for religious values. Every American has that right. But when the politicians claim those values are key to healthier, safer, more prosperous communities, they're making an empirical claim. And empirical claims can be tested, and they should be tested, because that is how democracy is supposed to work. We don't judge political philosophies by how inspiring they sound. We judge them by whether people's lives improve, whether children are healthier and families are more secure and schools are stronger, whether communities are safer and opportunities expand, and whether people actually flourish. Character isn't measured by campaign slogans. Compassion isn't measured by how many times a politician says, "God bless America." And morality isn't measured by how loudly someone condemns everybody else. It's measured by outcomes, by whether your neighbors are better off because of the choices you made while you were in power. So the next time someone tells you America's problems can all be solved by putting Christianity back at the center of government, don't argue. Don't roll your eyes. Just ask the question. The same question I've been asking for the last hour or so. Where are the results? Show me the evidence. Because faith deserves respect. Politics deserves scrutiny. And every political promise, no matter who makes it, should eventually have to show its receipts. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to download and listen to this Friday edition of Back Porch Files from your neighbor on the left. I am thrilled that you did. I would love to hear from you on this topic. I would love to hear what you have to say about this or any topic for that matter. Suggestions, critiques, compliments, whatever you have to share, I would love to hear it. As I mentioned at the beginning, go to the website, neighborontheleft.com, and all the tools are there for you to comment, listen to more, see the sources that I use, whatever it is that you're interested in. The weekend is here, so I'll be back on Monday with another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. Between now and then, I would like you to stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of weekend you'd wish for others.